anxiously awaited the winner of the presidential election.
I'm drinking before the result because I have the dual citizenship, and in November I end up not drinking at all.
In Astoria, a plea to take climate change more seriously.
We know climate change is real. It's going to have a direct effect on our economy, our health, on our political world. I mean, there isn't anything that climate change is not going to touch.
Lack of affordable housing is a problem. One landlord says he has an answer.
In the city, we'd have much more housing if we didn't have as much regulation as we have.
It's all coming up on Uptown Radio. France has a new president. Centrist Emmanuel Macron won yesterday with nearly 66% of the vote. The 39-year-old political newcomer beat Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader who wanted France to pull out of the European Union.
French nationals living in New York City voted overwhelmingly for Macron. Nina Friend watched the election returns yesterday with a group of Macron supporters on the Upper West Side.
At 1 p.m., Café Tallulah on 71st and Columbus is filled with French nationals hoping for good news. It's hot, loud, and crowded. Nervous energy pulses through the space, and it smells like cigarettes and truffle fries. Reports from France fill the two large TV screens. Emily, who didn't want to give her last name, is from Paris. She moved to New York almost a year ago. Today, she's nervous.
Everyone say that the Brexit won't happen, that Trump won't happen, and it happened. So I think it's important to France to not go on the wrong side.
Her family is still in France, but she plans to stay in the States if Marine Le Pen wins.
If Marine became president, I'm not sure we're going to come home for the time she's president.
Emily's husband, a Brazilian named Felipe Navarro, who became a French citizen upon marriage, is more hopeful.
The American election brought some doubts, I think, to everybody, but I have some hope in the French people, and I trust them to do the right choice.
Former journalist Anne-Marie Benoun is downing a glass of wine, hoping for a better outcome than in the U.S. elections.
I'm drinking before the result because I have the dual citizenship, and in November I end up not drinking at all.
Just 10 minutes before 2 p.m. in New York and 8 p.m. in France, when the polls close, the room becomes louder as more people file in. We're squeezed so tightly you can feel someone's heart beat on your back. At this point, Pace University student Killian Tepp starts to worry.
I'm starting to feel the stress right now. Sure, we're all optimistic, we all think that he's going to win, and he most likely will. But at the same time, we have to be aware that we're not necessarily representative of France as a whole.
And then, at 2 p.m., the room goes quiet. Macron wins in a landslide. Some FaceTime their families back home. Others, like Veronica, pop champagne, the good stuff.
Democracy has won after so many weeks of tension. And as I am holding my glass of champagne, and this is really champagne, okay, from France, Veuve Clicquot.
Florent Joy is opening a bottle of his own. He has been the main point person for Macron's campaign in New York City.
We were all relieved to find that he's won. For those of us who've been following and supporting Macron since the beginning, it was more of a pride feeling and just a happiness for having spent the last 9 months really for a reason.
The votes in this room mattered. Joy says French expats make up 3% of the total electorate, which is larger than Paris.
The French people here today are very proud that Macron was able to overturn the direction that history was taking. En marche.
A few more champagne toasts, and by 3:30 p.m., many are getting ready to leave, to go back out into New York City, far from home. Nina Friend, Columbia Radio News.
It's the day after the election in France, and now the mood is a little bit more sober as reality sets in. I spoke with Grégoire Moll, a reporter based in Burgundy, France. He's been following the election closely. So maybe we can start by you just telling us a bit about what the atmosphere is like in France right now.
Well, there are two emotions, I think, that are dominant. The polls were really in Macron's favor. but people were still a little bit on edge. So there is this relief that she didn't win and she lost, but also there's been a massive abstention and like a very low turnout for a French presidential election, and also a lot of people who went to cast a blank ballot in sign of protest. So a lot of people also are not in line with what Macron is proposing and offering. So it's quite a divided France, I think, today that is waking up from the campaign. And there were actually demonstrations just as soon as yesterday. There were demonstrations in several cities in France to protest against the new president.
And so how will this sort of shape the next few years?
Well, it's hard to tell because something that's going to be very significant is the next election, which is in 1 month in France, which is the parliament election. So basically, without a majority, Macron is going to have a very hard time implementing his agenda and his program. So now he has to focus on getting a majority in the parliament. And given what we had in the first round of the election 2 weeks ago, pretty much 4 candidates almost, having an equal score of 20% pretty much each, it's going to be a very divisive and very fragmented parliament. To answer your question, it's not very clear if the newly elected president will be able to get everyone together and everyone united around his program and his persona.
And so where were you yesterday when the results came in? Can you describe what you saw and what you heard?
I was with my family watching TV. We do that at election. We watch TV together with like tomato pie. So yeah, I was with them and I was in front of my TV at 8 o'clock when the results came in.
And so I guess the victory was obviously quite overwhelming, but we can't ignore that some people did vote for Le Pen. So what do you think it means for the people that did vote for her?
I think they're very disappointed. I think there surely is a big movement around the party and Marine Le Pen, and there are a lot of concerns about security issues. France is still under a state of emergency since the November 2015 attacks, so there is a lot of concerns about security. There are a lot of concerns about unemployment and globalization. Macron has championed globalization and a deeper integration with Europe. So these fears are not going away, I think, with Macron unless he's able to turn around the unemployment and get more and more people back to work. Because in France, we still have quite a high unemployment rate. I think it's around 10%.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
All right, amazing. Thank you. It's been fun.
That was Gregoire Moll talking to us from France.
Last month, tens of thousands of protesters gathered in Washington, D.C. for the People's Climate March. But there were other smaller protests, too. In the small Queens community of Astoria, nearly 100 people showed up to protest the proximity of power plants to low-income housing and their fears that rising sea levels could wash away park land. Patrick Martin reports from Queens.
Astoria Park sits next to the East River with sweeping views of the Manhattan skyline. Children swing and run around on the playground, while adults relax sprawled out on the Great Lawn. You would have never believed a superstorm caused billions of dollars in damages just a few short years ago. Costa Constantinides is a city councilman and a member of the Environmental Committee. He urges the Trump administration to realize climate change is not a hoax.
So we know climate change is real. It's going to have a direct effect on our economy, our health, on our political world. I mean, there isn't anything that climate change is not going to touch.
It's even touched some of our most prehistoric residents through the burning of certain non-renewable resources.
All of the fossil fuels that we burn, they're called fossil fuels because they are embedded carbon. They are dinosaurs and plants and carbon that is trapped within the Earth's surface.
That's Rebecca Bratsby's. She's an environmental lawyer who lives in Astoria.
The fact is that the sea levels are rising and no amount of denial is going to make it not be happening.
It may not be denial, but the Trump administration is rolling back Obama-era climate programs, the very programs that would help communities like Astoria. In March, plans were made to cut the Environmental Protection Agency by more than 30%. What were some of the programs in the crosshairs? You guessed it, climate change education and clean power. Even kids in high school are upset.
I'm in Global Kids. It's a nonprofit organization geared at youth empowerment, and most recently we've been working to mandate climate education in New York City public schools.
That's 17-year-old Kate Scherer. She marched in Washington. She also made sure other protesters there knew about the major environmental hazards in Astoria, like asthma.
I just do know that it's really one of the bigger things in areas like public housing areas and areas like in Astoria and Long Island City, just because they are so close to
power plants. More than half of the city's energy comes from plants in western Queens. They burn dirty fuel like No. 6 oil. Although City Council has mandated to phase No. 6 oil by 2020, power plants burnt more than 19 million gallons in 2015. Again, Costa Constantinides.
Now, why do I say that's important? Because 6 oil looks like black tar, has the most particulate matter, has the most nitrous oxide, has the most sulfur oxide, the stuff that gets into your lungs when it's burned, the soot that causes asthma.
And it's affecting Astoria.
We see the asthma rates skyrocketing in communities. And I know for me here in Astoria, we have 11101, 11102, and 11106. Those 3 zip codes have higher than average asthma, both ER admissions and hospitalizations across the board.
No. 6 oil may be on its way out, but there are still other fuels that won't be phased out until 13 years from now. Constantinides said it's too long and has put forward a petition. It will call for power plants to stop burning all dirty fossil fuels. Patrick Martin, Columbia Radio News.
The People's Climate March wasn't the only mass D.C. protest in April. A week prior, thousands gathered in both Washington, D.C. and in over 600 other cities for the March for Science. Trump, the candidate, suggested that climate change was a hoax. President Trump has proposed drastic cuts to scientific research and agencies.
But did the march achieve its goals? And what's next in the fight to defend science? Emily Dixon has the story.
In New York City, science marchers gathered from Central Park West to Trump Tower at Columbus Circle, chanting and holding signs. One reads, "Don't make the nerds angry." Another, "Without science, we'd still be casting spells on the Black Death."
Well, I feel that science is important, facts are important, and we need to fight for them.
That's Anna Almeida, who's a nurse. She's wearing a flower crown and holding a banner showing Lady Justice, Mother Nature, and Lady Liberty. Almeida says it demonstrates how they're all interconnected. 12-year-old Isaac Kruger's sign has a message for the president.
It says, "Not my resident," and it has the Earth saying that to Trump.
He's marching in defense of one specific field.
It's because I believe in global warming, and I believe we should do something about it.
Many scientists are marching to draw attention to the importance of their work, like neurobiologist Eliza Diaz, who says she's afraid the general public doesn't see the value in her field.
I think it's important that population realizes that science is a vital part of life. People take for granted a lot of everything that we do and that science does for humanity.
The Central Washington, D.C. march was co-organized by Caroline Weinberg, a New York-based public health researcher.
I got involved in it because I had a friend who is a climate science educator who was told that she couldn't talk about her research anymore.
Though Weinberg's work focuses on medicine and public health, she was motivated to organize by threats spanning the scientific field.
All science is under attack at the moment. The one that kind of gets the most play is climate change and environmental research, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak.
2 weeks after the march, she's not ready to determine whether it achieved its goals.
I mean, to the degree that what I was really aiming for with the march was to draw attention to it and have kind of a big global moment, yes, it definitely did. To the degree that kind of the end game of the march is to create lasting change, we won't really know the answer to that for a year.
One of the march's great successes, she says, is that 70% of the protesters didn't actually work in science. That's important to Weinberg, because she says increased communication between scientists and the broader public is vital. But one of the biggest criticisms of the march while it was being planned, alongside concerns about its diversity and inclusivity, is that it would politicize a field that's supposed to be neutral and objective. Even some attendees expressed their concerns, like Tina Sue, who's studying immunology at Yale.
I think this march shouldn't be partisan-based. It's really important that science is depoliticized, and unfortunately this march has become politicized to a certain point.
But others have argued that science is inevitably political, though not necessarily partisan, since its practice is governed by policies and budgets determined in Washington. Caroline Weinberg doesn't consider the Trump approach to science a new development.
I mean, the truth is that this, anti-science policies have been around for decades, and this march should have been organized, or could have been organized, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, this is not like a new concept, but the idea that it's gotten so blatant and so severe that, thousands of people around the world decided to kind of devote 3 months of their lives to organizing a march for science and for facts and it's mind-boggling.
But what happens now the protest is over? The March for Science website has a host of suggestions to sustain the pro-science momentum, including supporting professional advocacy societies, signing an environmental voter pledge, or even hosting a science-themed game night. The organizers' biggest hope? That protesters will keep fighting for science, long after they put their signs away. Emily Dixon, Columbia Radio News.
If you know how to protect yourself online, it might be because of where you live. Education about digital security is not spread out evenly throughout the United States, and experts call this problem the digital security gap. Harlem is one of the places that's often overlooked.
The other day, my co-host Megan Morelli went to Harlem to learn about a new project, one that's teaching Harlem residents ways to take control over who sees their online lives.
Access to online privacy has a lot to do with race and class. A few days ago, about 40 people gathered in a co-working space in Harlem for a crypto party, which is less of a party and more of a monthly meetup. Here's Gasu Lalenta, one of the participants.
With the pace that our world is changing, it's always good to be aware of, where are the vulnerabilities to yourself as a citizen.
Education about digital security is especially important in Harlem, but it's hard to find here. The crypto party is run by a guy named Matt Mitchell, who is trying to bridge Harlem's digital security gap by educating his neighborhood about online privacy.
I'm a security researcher and the founder of Crypto Harlem. A lot of the dark side of technology, it doesn't affect us all evenly. If you're lesbian, gay, if you're gender nonconforming, if you're black or brown, you're going to find that this technology has a much harsher effect on you, more negative effect on you.
That's because police will actually go and look through social media accounts of Harlem residents to figure out who's who in the neighborhood. They'll take residents in for questioning and make arrests based on Facebook likes and Instagram photos. I took a walk to hear about how local residents feel about this.
I don't know. It's something creepy about that.
That's 26-year-old Apollo Coles. I found him sitting on a quiet bench in Marcus Garvey Park. He's had police look through his online activity a bunch of times.
Facebook, Instagram stands for FBI, so they definitely do use that. They go on there and look at pictures.
Apollo says he and a lot of his friends have been brought in for questioning by police because cops have tracked him on Facebook and Instagram. I asked him if he'd ever heard of anything like a crypto party.
No, I never thought about that, but that is a good idea because I see a lot of people targeted because of social media, so it happens more often than you think.
In order to help residents keep their private lives private, a national initiative is partnering up with community leaders like Mitchell to help residents like Apollo. The spearhead of this project is a guy in California named Josh Levy. He says that even though a lot of low-income communities have worked to bridge the digital security gap, most still don't have the resources to keep themselves fully protected.
So the goal of this project is to connect those frontline organizations and people working within them to connect them to digital security experts who can help build capacity.
The initiative Josh is launching is called the Digital Security Exchange, which is going to bring experts into communities like Harlem to teach residents about the topic. He is a self-admitted academic white guy, though, so he says that it's important that the message comes from within the community itself.
You need somebody who's, at the very least, familiar with that community, but most likely part of that community on some level, so that there's trust already built and you're not starting from zero. So you don't want to have a cis, white, well-meaning man parachuting into an LGBTQ community of color and saying, let me help you. That's probably going to go pretty badly.
Matt says he feels the same way.
And so when we're talking about fighting this technology, we have to talk about giving resources to the directly affected so they can solve their own problems, because only they will know how best to do that.
The Digital Security Exchange is not only going to provide education, it's also going to give funding to communities experiencing a digital security gap. The project is expected to launch in communities in New York and in the rest of the U.S. by fall of 2017. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Megan Morelli.
It's been over a decade since former Mayor Bloomberg's reforms allowed New York City parents to apply for their children to attend schools outside their zip code. But a recent investigation by the New York Times finds school choice has resulted in making New York City the most segregated school system in the country. We're having technical difficulties right now. We'll get to the story on the New York Times investigation and the school system briefly. The New York Rent Guidelines Board met late last month to vote on how much landlords are allowed to increase rent on rent-stabilized apartments. In a preliminary vote, the board recommended a 1 to 3% increase on one-year leases and a 2 to 4% increase on two-year leases. The increases come after a 3-year rent freeze. As Whitney Kimball reports, the annual meeting was particularly contentious.
In 2016, landlords made more money than ever. This, despite the record number of new affordable units and 2 years of rent freezes on rent-stabilized apartments, which make up nearly half of the housing stock in New York City. Rent-stabilized tenants are calling for rent rollback this year, asking for rent cuts as much as 7%. To no surprise, landlords would like an 8% raise. Last month, the Rent Guidelines Board held a preliminary vote to set the maximum amount which landlords are allowed to increase the rents. The meetings are often raucous events with angry tenants, and this year was no different. Whitney Kimball reports. I'm standing outside Cooper Union, where about 60 people are juggling umbrellas and signs against the gusts of wind and rain. The signs say rollback. During the Bloomberg era, the Rent Guidelines Board often allowed between 4 and 7% raises in rent each year. Tenants feel that it's time to undo the damage. The rules for rent-stabilized apartments generally apply to units under $2,500 per month in buildings built up to 1974. But tenants argue that landlords find all sorts of ways around the rules. Hannah, a woman in her 30s, remembers moving into her first apartment in Crown Heights just after college. The previous tenant was an old woman who had died. All of her belongings were out on the street.
Now I'm like, I know what that new tenancy did to that apartment, and I know that probably the landlord overcharged us to jack up the stabilized price of the apartment and didn't tell us it was stabilized, and we didn't know anything about stabilization.
Carlos Ortiz of Catholic Migration Services in Queens stands on the fringes watching the protest. I ask him what he would say to a landlord who needs to replace a boiler. Wouldn't they need to be compensated for those costs?
You know, when you speak of a boiler, and the useful life of a boiler is like 20 to 25 years, right? A lot of landlords will attempt to change the boiler before its useful life has expired, and they will get away with submitting that for a rent increase to the Department of Housing and Community Renewal, wherein people will start seeing, maybe like a 50% increase per month.
That would be called an MCI, or Major Capital Improvement, which a landlord can use to file for rent raises. Standing on the steps of Cooper Union are Sheila Garcia and Harvey Epstein, the members of the Rent Guidelines Board whose job it is to represent tenants. They watch the protest. They look weary. Garcia is well aware of the MCI scam.
What's a really common MCI, like a boiler breaking or something? Like, what do people charge?
So it can't be like a change. You can't change a piece of the boiler. You have to change majority of the whatever system you're repairing. So sometimes it's boiler, painting the whole building, doing the whole roof, changing all the windows, the boiler completely not working, or the hot water. And they're supposed to provide receipts and evidence they did that work. And so
she adds that renters should look up their building's rent history so that they don't end up in a situation like Hannah's, where the previous tenant dies and the new tenants are oblivious to the stabilization. Inside Cooper Union's auditorium, the scene is similar. The Rent Guidelines Board sits on stage. Protesters, young and old, with rollback signs and matching union shirts, have children in tow. Meanwhile, a group of middle-aged men in suits look on from the entrance. I ask several of them whether they are landlords or tenants, and they say no. Finally, Jack Freund is fetched from the audience. He is the vice president of the Rent Stabilization Association. The group represents 25,000 landlords.
Well, there's a stereotypical view of a landlord, of a large owner of property, characterized by greed, avarice, and disdain for humanity. In fact,
earlier this year, Freund's organization lost a lawsuit against the Rent Guidelines Board, which, they claimed, did not fairly account for expenses like sewer charges and repairs when it froze the rents. But he says that's not really what keeps the rents up.
The prime reason is because real estate taxes in the city are so expensive and constantly going up. That is what drives rents up. So if we want to have rent freezes, it's a very simple proposition. All the mayor has to do is freeze real estate taxes, and then essentially there won't be a need.
Freund believes that rent-stabilized apartments should be phased out for the good of the city. The regulation is the problem, he says.
For the good of the city, we'd have much more housing if we didn't have as much regulation as we have.
And do you think that the free market would take care of affordable housing simply if we had more units?
No, I mean, we definitely need more units, but there are always going to be people in the city who are too poor to afford a rent, no matter how low that rent is. For those people, the answer is not rent freezes or low rents. It is income supplementation. That's the way to go.
Back in the auditorium, the tenants' representatives, Sheila Garcia and Harvey Epstein, make their case for a rollback. According to Epstein, 43% of the people entering the shelter system come out of rent-stabilized apartments. But the Rent Guidelines Board votes against the rollback. In the end, they approve a modest raise of 1 to 3% on a one-year lease and 2 to 4% on a two-year lease.
Roll back! You're fucking over New Yorkers!
That's just the range. They'll decide the final number in June. Even if the maximum raise of 4% may not seem that high, if your rent is $1,000 per month, you lose $40 in groceries. After years upon years of rent raises, that adds up. On the way out of the meeting, I meet Gladys, 53, who lives in Bushwick. She tells me that it's coming down to a choice between rent and food.
Yes. My rent is keep going higher. My salary is staying the same for 18 years. Now with this raising that they're talking about, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent no more. I'm not going to be able to afford it. I'm going to be a homeless person.
Gladys says that if worse comes to worse, she can always stay with her daughter. But many in New York aren't that lucky. This is Whitney Kimball for Uptown Radio.
And now we're returning to our education story. So I have It's been over a decade since former Mayor Bloomberg's reforms allowed New York City parents to apply for their children to attend schools outside of their zip code. But a recent Times investigation finds school choice has resulted in making New York City the most segregated school system in the country. So I have on the line Jennifer Berkshire. She's a freelance education journalist and the writer of the nationally recognized blog, Have You Heard? And Jennifer, there was a big feature that came out in the New York Times this weekend by Elizabeth Harris, The Broken Promises of Choice in New York City Schools. And essentially it used data to show that the New York City public schools are still segregated at alarming rates. What were your reactions to the piece?
I thought it was an incredible piece of reporting, and that it really showed in a kind of vivid, first-hand way what happens when you lay on top of a landscape that's already really segregated and deeply, deeply unequal. When you lay choice on top of that, and you can actually end up deepening the divisions that you're trying to fix.
Yeah, since the Michael Bloomberg era, he made it so eighth graders could apply to 12 schools matched by an algorithm, and that was supposed to improve school choice and improve integration. How has that worked or not worked?
Well, if you know anyone who's gone through New York City's, incredibly complicated and onerous school choice process, it's immediately, it's easy to understand why students who come from backgrounds with the most advantage go into that process with an incredible leg up. And that's really what that story confirmed, that students are thrown into the same competitive mix without controlling in any way the difference in their background. And that just, when you look at the results of what's happened, it just seems amazing to me that the Bloomberg people could have thought that this was the thing that was going to fix New York City's segregated and unequal neighborhoods.
And you mentioned the results, and the article showed that the average New York City Black or Hispanic student, both in elementary and high school, is at a school that is just 8% white. What kind of impact does that have academically, both on students of color and the white students at the school?
Well, it has a huge impact, and I thought, there was one line in that story that I thought was so telling. New York schools are segregated because New York's neighborhoods are segregated, and no one has an answer for that. And the problems start early on, and so you have your most affluent students attending, elementary schools where they're already on a path towards more selective schools, whereas students who are attending schools where their classmates are overwhelmingly minority and overwhelmingly poor tend to end up in middle schools and then high schools that look that way as well.
So if you were to kind of give your prescription to the problem, what would it be?
Well, first of all, that the problem of schools cannot be fixed without thinking about the communities that they're in. You hear from urban education reformers all the time, that your education is your ticket out of your neighborhood. But what does that mean for the neighborhood? In New York, there's, the real challenge these days is you have this incredible pace of gentrification. And so, you have the problem of inequality is only getting worse. And so, we're going to have to think about what that means in terms of housing. And finally, I'm encouraged that there's growing attention to the role that policy plays in responding to segregation. That you cannot expect to integrate the schools just by leaving the choice up to individual parents. It doesn't work that way. We made huge progress in this country in the 70s because it was government policy to integrate schools. I was bused in my elementary school years, and until we acknowledge that and make that policy again, we're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye. That was Jennifer Berkshire, freelance education journalist and writer of the nationally recognized blog Have You Heard? For more than 40 years, shoppers looking for photo and electronic equipment have gone to B&H in Manhattan. Recently, the store has faced multiple discrimination lawsuits for the mistreatment of their employees who work in their warehouse.
B&H workers voted to unionize last year to improve their working conditions. Within months, B&H announced it is moving its warehouses to New Jersey, 2 hours outside the city, and taking as many as 350 jobs with it. Workers have been protesting the move in front of the store. My co-host, Eli Horowitz, went to a protest to get the latest on the ongoing battle.
At 34th Street and 9th Avenue, under the green B&H awning, hundreds of Sunday strollers are weaving around a group of 20 protesters. One of those protesters is Chris Maui.
Union busting! We're out here protesting the fact that in response to their workers at the warehouses trying to form a union, the B&H management's decided to, instead of negotiate with those unions legally, move the warehouses 75 miles away to New Jersey, where the workers can't possibly maintain their jobs.
One employee facing that very predicament is Andre Martinez, who's worked at B&H for 8 years. I have 2 hernias from carrying heavy boxes of 80 and 90 pounds at work. I've been affected significantly. I can't work. The Laundry Workers Center has helped workers like Martinez organize and ultimately unionize. Mahome Lopez works at the center and was at the protest. He says that the employees voted to join the United Steelworkers Union last year, and B&H is trying to bust the union.
They are planning to move to New Jersey. That's basically a tactic to run away from the union.
Lopez says they can't stop B&H from moving their warehouse, but they can try to get customers to boycott the store.
Basically put pressure to the company, ask to the customers to don't buy because we need to support the workers. We cannot permit lose 300 jobs in New York City just because this company is very greedy.
If you walk into B&H, you'll see many Hasidic employees and managers. Most decline to comment, but employee Chester Strolovich says the move to New Jersey is nothing more than a real estate decision.
We're always very happy to see each other. We love each other.
What should I say?
How do you respond to what's going on here? What's your side of the story?
B&H has lost the contract of the buildings in Evergreen Avenue and the Navy Yard. We have to move from there, and we found a huge place in Florence, New Jersey.
Strolovich says B&H might give employees train vouchers or $5,000 to help employees find new jobs. No one from management confirmed this. One manager came outside and gave me a copy of B&H's official statement, which calls the allegations of discrimination false. Minutes later, New York City Council member Ben Kalos stumbled upon the protests and joined in.
B&H needs to make sure that they take care of their employees, and they shouldn't be closing up any of their warehouses and moving them anywhere but New York City. If you're using warehouses outside the city, then you're not a city company.
Kalos, who represents the Upper East Side, East Harlem, and Roosevelt Island, says B&H is a staple of New York, and he's actually shopped there himself. But he says what they're doing is wrong.
When your employees organize and they have an election to join a union, closing up shop and moving somewhere else isn't right.
For now, workers like Andre Martinez, the employee out of work with 2 hernias, have no choice but to make the 4-hour round-trip commute to New Jersey if they want to keep their jobs. I'm in doubt as to whether or not I'll go. I don't know yet. I have my family here. The protesters are hoping their picket lines and a strike on International Workers' Day could force B&H to change their minds. Eli Horowitz, Columbia Radio News.
Go to the 4th floor of the Brooklyn Museum and you'll find the latest exhibition. It's called We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women. It features the works of black female artists between the years 1965 to 1985, when second-wave feminism was emerging. Sweeney St. Ville has the story about what this body of work means for today's generation of young black women.
Catherine Morris is co-curator of the We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women exhibit. She explained that the idea came after she and co-curator Rujeko Hockley discussed ways to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum.
We really thought about exhibitions that kind of tell different stories than the sort of typical, mostly white and largely middle class kind of narratives. We were really interested in communities of color and African American women in particular.
The exhibit is open to the public, but Morris imagines that young black women will make up a large part of its audience.
Young women of color seem to be particularly wanting to know this history, wanting to see the people who came before them and found themselves in similar positions and how they made their fights, how they took their stands, how they made their work, how they made it in the world. There's the homage to my young black sisters, which I just love, thinking about this older artist who would have been in her 60s at the time, setting out to make this work in support of a younger generation of women who she sees as, wanting to change the world.
Elizabeth Catlett is the artist. The work of art, it's a wooden sculpture in the shape of a woman's body. The woman is holding her fist up in the air, kind of like the fist you imagine when you think of Angela Davis. This painting and all other artwork in the exhibit inspires and paves the way for young black women and young black artists. Alexandra Smith is one of those artists. She visited the exhibit after months of having it marked down on her calendar. She wanted to see it because an exhibit like this is out of the ordinary.
In a museum, an institution of this caliber, to mount a show featuring black women artists, that's funny. The fact that even happened, it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely not something that happens often or has happened ever. I think it's the first time.
Smith is excited to see that women of color are finally being given a platform to express themselves. She thinks it's a fitting time since we are in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement.
It's an important time to highlight the achievements of black women because we've been at the forefront of every major historical movement that you can think of, and a lot of times our involvement is erased or ignored, and black men and men in general are given credit.
She believes that the We Wanted a Revolution exhibition is mutually beneficial for viewers of the art and the artists themselves.
A lot of the legends that are in that show, some of them are still alive. I think it's really important to show them that we know history and the work that you put in, and we appreciate you. And I think it's important for them to see that, just as it's important for us to learn, because it's not being taught in major colleges and universities.
Danielle Rose went to Georgetown University for undergrad and recently graduated last year from Morgan State University, a historically black college in Baltimore. Neither of the curriculums taught about the history of black women.
I can honestly say that in my studies on both campuses, I didn't really get a lot of knowledge or talk a lot about black women and the contributions that they've made to America.
The We Wanted a Revolution Black Radical Women 1965 to 85 exhibit will be on display until September 17th of this year. Sweeney Saintville, Columbia Radio News.
Well, that does it for this episode of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our executive producer was Patrick Martin. He also coordinated our studio production.
Our webcaster, Emily Dixon, got this stream live to the web, and editor Nina Friend led our copy team. Sweeney Saintville was our soundbite producer.
Our instructors, Carrie Donahue and Catherine Lamfer, advise our staff. I'm Eli Horowitz.
And I'm Megan Morelli. Uptown Radio is live Fridays at 4 p.m. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Columbia Radio News, thanks for listening.